we must develop an intellectual practice whereby the Black experience is not subsumed under the dead letter and rendered one-dimensional and static across space and time. It is also, we also must at the same time understand that it is a fundamental encounter with this imperial thing, this imperial project we call America. Thus, the conditions of possibility, of planetary possibility that this moment speaks to, hence the huge outpouring global forms of solidarity in Paris, in Australia, in Asia, across the African continent, in Brazil, and throughout America, all 50 states, is a moment of potential planetary possibility that exceeds the categorical logic that then wants to subsume this moment to a rendered flat idea of what constitutes Black people. So in the wake of this American Spring, the question that I want us to raise, I want us to explore in this moment, is a question that Angela Davis develops in her interview collection with Eduardo Mendez. How do we imagine a better world and raise the questions that permit us to see beyond the given? Notice Davis is not saying, let me give a particular account or knowledge or absolute fundamental understanding. She wants us to raise the questions that permit us to see beyond the given. Because in raising the question, much as we see in the intellectual practice of Vincent Harding, what Davis does is it is the questions that open up possibility of exploration, and it is questions that give rise to a community of intellectual practice that can be deployed to engage this moment. So with Davis's question, I want us to go back to her idea that she develops in conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois, and that's the idea of abolition democracy. And it is this broad, expansive idea that we see folks gravitating around, and one aspect of it that is causing so much struggle in the US context around defunding the police. Defunding the police is part of a broader project of abolition democracy. It comes out of the same formation that we see in critical resistance that Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore are part of in the 1990s. But it also is a longer trajectory coming out of the prison liberation movements of the 1970s. And what we're seeing with these transformations is an opening up and liberation of democracy itself. These are some of the fundamental characteristics that Davis is pointing to, that Harding is pointing to, and that also we see with C.L.R. James. Davis seeks to liberate democracy from capitalist democracy. And she states this very eloquently. Today, the tendency to assume that the only version of democracy available to us is capitalist democracy poses a challenge. We must be able to disentangle our notions of capitalism and democracy so that we may pursue truly egalitarian models of democracy. What she's arguing here is for a conceptual freedom precipitated by forms of political struggle. So in this moment, what we're seeing is possibly this political struggle that can then inaugurate a new modality of conceptual freedom around democracy itself. That the calls to defund the police are part of a broader framework, a broader fabric to actually begin to rethink the very fundamental ideas of democracy itself. The challenge is not to funnel the forms of political struggle into outmoded forms of actually existing democracy. This is what Davis does when she develops her theoretical framework of abolition democracy from the work of Du Bois's 1935 text, Black Reconstruction. And it is the elaboration of that title that is vitally important for us. Because Du Bois writes that, Du Bois titles it Black Reconstruction, an essay toward a history of the part which Black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880. It is this text which links the emergence of Du Bois and for Du Bois of a new state of political affairs. This is Du Bois developing and deploying the idea of the general strike. This is Du Bois reimagining what it meant for Black labor to move away from plantations and begin to articulate different sensibilities around what possibly constitutes a new form of democracy. It is also a text in which Du Bois links the emergence of the carceral state and its concomitant policing practices and the evolution of capitalist political economy. And here we need to recognize that the dominant discourse within our contemporary moment decouples the functions of the carceral state and its policing practices from the evolution and development of capitalist political economy. That is, the same neoliberal capitalism that has rendered redundant and that seeks to move Black labor into the carceral apparatus, along with the defunding and decoupling of any broad social safety net and the whittling down of the state to the logic of the market, is completely is implicated in the current uprising. All too often, the critique of actually existing capitalism, the critique of neoliberal forms of capitalism falls out of the dominant analysis. And what we have is a racial discourse that is absent any critical material foundation. Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction, this penitentiary system, the system of the penitentiary, not only in the South, but also its ancillary, its appendages, when we think of the ways in which chain gangs operate, began to characterize the entire political economy of the South. And I should add, throughout from roughly 1870 to 1930, we see this rise in what can be the capitalist carceral system. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, many businesses challenged the carceral logic because penitentiaries and prisons undermine their market share. We see a new rise in labor, particularly carceral labor, in penitentiaries in and around the emergence of Ronald Reagan, 1982, and what globally became the Thatcher, Cole, Reagan era. So when we begin to think of the penitentiary and the carceral state, we have to think through it with the changes in capitalist political economy, that we cannot decouple the two and allow just a racial logic to then serve as the explanatory factor, particularly when we know that these penitentiary and policing mechanisms disproportionately target low-income communities and low-income Black and Brown communities, particularly now when we understand and when we see that the largest population within the federal penitentiary system in the United States are Latino immigrants. And that is also a function of the ways in which the capitalist state is transformed and continued its policing practices around immigration. What Davis does with this in Abolition Democracy is begin to expand the horizon of critical engagement beyond just the horizon of thinking in and through a particular reductionist racial logic. Owing to her reading of Du Bois, she's able to then look at the ways in which democracy can be redeployed in a fundamentally transformative manner that transforms all of the political terrain. In this sense, what she reminds us of is a notion of an idea developed in Amy Césaire's discourse on colonialism. What Césaire does is Césaire reminds us that we not only must think the question of man. And I'm sure last week with Lewis Gordon, it was this conversation around the human that really came to the forefront. But Césaire connects this fundamental discourse with the discourse of the nation. Césaire writes in Discourse on Colonialism, one of the values invented by the bourgeoisie in former times and launched throughout the world was man. And we have seen what has become of that. The other was the nation. It is a fact. The nation is a bourgeois phenomenon. In fetishizing the nation as form, one can substitute what Césaire is talking about, Europe for America, to the same debilitating effect. Césaire would write, so once again, be careful. American domination, the only domination from which one never recovers, I mean from which one never recovers unscarred. Césaire not only wants us to think of the foundational figure of Western thought, the human, he also reminds us that the forms and subjectivities, political subjectivities of that human encapsulated within that construct of the nation must also be critically engaged. For the nation begins to form and shape particular types of political subjects for the project of the nation, as well as the project of capitalist modernity. And it is here where Angela Davis's work of abolition democracy seeks to render asunder those foundational assumptions that have us by the throat. In many ways, the channels of reform that we see so many people arguing against around defunding the police have yet to then move to the broader plane of how do we fundamentally reconstruct democracy in America. It is that question that Davis raises, that the issue of defunding the police is constitutive of. It is not ancillary to that, it is constitutive of the broader project of abolition democracy. And this is not at the level of the nation, and I'll end right here, this is at the level of the planetary. Because what we see now in the crisis that we face globally, a crisis that's not only a crisis in global political economy, a crisis that is not also a crisis globally that's rendered by the ways in which the pandemic has affected our planetary existence, but it is a crisis at the ways in which we deal with the crisis we confront with global climate change. This is a planetary moment, and it is a planetary possibility. Much like the Arab Spring opened up new planetary possibilities for what in Tunisia was the revolution for human dignity. This moment of the American Spring and this moment of abolition democracy given to us by the work of Angela Davis opens up a new way of thinking at what is a global level horizon. And this is too linked to the ways in which W.E.B. Du Bois, post-1945, really animated globality in his thinking. If we remember Du Bois's famous statement in 1903 around the color line is a statement about planetary existence and planetary possibility. It is about the relation of humans across the world. Nahum Chandler, who's connected with GCAS as well, reminds us of this in his wonderful essay, Toward an African Future of the Limit of the Future World. Du Bois's thinking, a thinking that's animated and anchors and then is expanded in the work of Angela Davis, reminds us of the global dimensions of planetary possibility, as well as global dimensions that can then affirm limits beyond a global order predicated on isolating and maintaining imperial orders of national sovereignty. So I want us to begin to open up that possibility. Is America possible? Well, we began with that simple question, not focused solely on national sovereignty, but taking up the project of abolition democracy in the American Spring to begin to think how we can engage in a new planetary existence, a new planetary possibility beyond the categories of the same. Thank you.
Great, Corey, thank you very much. Really, we're going to have some questions down the road here. We want to hear from Sean. So I want to introduce Sean McFessel. Is that right? McFessel? Sean McFessel has been involved in social movements for nearly 30 years, researching and participating in them across the United States, Western and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. He's the author of 2 books on contemporary social movement dynamics: Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be, Unarmed Insurrection and the Rhetoric of Resistance, and Suffold How It Gush, a North American anarchist in the Balkans. He's currently a member of the English faculty at Highline College. Sean will go for just over 20 minutes, and then I'll ask both you guys a couple questions, and we can then open it up for general discussion. Thank you, and thank you again, Corey.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Corey, for a phenomenal talk. I feel like Dr. Walker's talk sort of really laid a framing for the conditions of possibility and the deep shifts that we're seeing, the kind of seismological shifts we're seeing appear in our moment. I might be a bit more like superficial. I think I'm more of a rhetorician than a philosopher. So what I try to do is I kind of try to understand the expressions that people are using and the kind of semiotic mechanisms, the way that people, and particularly social movements, constitute meaning in these moments, often that, as Dr. Walker pointed out, outstrip the understanding of scholars who are trying to follow them. And I think in order to understand those, we have to, all rhetorical expression happens sort of depending on its context and a really rich interplay with the material conditions that are going on. So looking at the kind of expectations we have of social movements and the shifts in material conditions that have occurred since some of our expectations were solidified is kind of what I specialize in. My research that I'm drawing on and that I wrote about in my book, Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be, was originally about the Occupy movement in 2011, 2012 a bit. And particularly, I was actually involved in the beginning in Occupy Wall Street, but I'm much more interested in some of the more radical manifestations that happened out on the West Coast, like Oakland and where I live now in Seattle. It was almost a different movement. We used some of the same sort of approaches and strategies, but in a way it was really a predecessor and really opened up some tactics and space for what became Black Lives Matter 2014, 2016, and now for what Dr. Walker is calling American Spring, which I like that term. So I'll take that from you. So, and a lot of the time I'm interested that, when we usually talk about these movements, people think of Occupy as this dead end movement that disappeared after bringing up, mortgages and Glass-Steagall Act and Black Lives Matter, rose up around Ferguson and then sort of kind of imploded and disappeared, maybe around electoral energy, I don't know. And then this current moment as if it's sort of, appearing out of Corona or whatever. And we forget the continuities of this struggle. In a lot of cases, I really think it's a lot of the same folks who are kind of bringing their approaches. And more than that, the people in each wave of these struggles are kind of picking up and really studying and really clearly thought about what people in the previous waves have done. So we saw, for example, in Occupy, it was this, moment of kind of making space and persisting in it as an approach for opening up space to, kind of force considerations of issues. And I think Occupy kind of found that was just having that was an important part of it, but just having that was a bit of a trap. And so it became kind of more outwardly focused and disruptive at the end, and trying to do stuff like kind of block highways and everything. And then that kind of ended it. It didn't have the internal sort of, hadn't thought it out enough to pull that off, and it was violently repressed by the police. Also importantly, Occupy was split and I wrote about this a lot in the book, and this would surface a lot in conversations about violence and nonviolence. It was split about attitudes about the police, and a lot of people from a more liberal perspective were kind of like, police are part of the 99%, we should pull them over. Whereas people coming from a essentially anti-racist perspective, anti-capitalist perspective, understood that the police are themselves, a central part of the problem, and we're not about to bring them over. Black Lives Matter 2014 kind of picked up with that contradiction and immediately starts, given the conditions that set off the Ferguson uprising, not only did it start with an acknowledgement the police are the issue, they're not like going to be our allies against the problem, they are the problem, but also started with the actual tactics, right? It kind of began with these freeway blockades, road blockades, and evolved all these kind of invasions into St. Louis and these disruptions of life as usual that Occupy just sort of began to dream of, and really, like, as it went national, developed those into some phenomenal approaches. And then it kind of, as it was getting repressed and broken apart for different reasons, it was sort of dreaming of taking it to the airports. Like, what would it really mean to hit really core infrastructure in this country hard that would be hard to ignore? And then the next wave of social movements that appeared was the anti-Trump immigration, migrant ban rallies, and the first thing they hit were the airports, right? So we have to see these things as a continual story. I draw a lot on, like a lot of folks involved with GCAS, I have an affection for the autonomous Marxist tradition. Dr. Walker was talking about the Forrest Johnson tendency, which is, I think of as kind of the root of it. And they talk about, for me, the foundational insight of autonomous Marxism is that you posit, rather than kind of Stalinist orthodox Marxism that thinks of capital as the mechanism that drives history, autonomous Marxists take the agency of the working class, the sort of self-realization of workers, as itself this open possibility that's always driving history. And so I think what we're seeing through this, I mean, you can look back in this way through all of history, right? But at least through these last 10 years, a very coherent story about what the agency of the working class, both within countries and globally, looks like in the sort of approaches that it takes and the tactics that it takes and the ways that it meets these forms of repression and kind of outdistances them. And also, in the analysis of autonomous Marxists, they basically look at history a lot of the time as this challenge where you have the agency of the working class asserting itself spontaneously in a way that sometimes radically outdistances the means of capital to reproduce itself. And then, of course, capital, with all of its powers, adapts and recuperates that. So, for example, the understanding of the previous wave of 60s and 70s, a lot of what brought young people to the barricades and into social conflict and into solidarity was the sort of liberation from the boredom of the welfare state and the mundanity of the sort of slow growth model. Neoliberalism ended up kind of emerging from that and co-opting some of that individuality and some of these sort of, taking my desires as reality because I believe in the reality of my desires. Neoliberalism kind of began with that and recuperated it into a new form of capitalism. So one of the things that I'm centrally interested in is the fact that we really draw, the way we talk about protests still is just borrowed entire as like a package deal from the discourse surrounding the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and yeah, what we saw kind of in the mid to late 60s, maybe if somebody's done a lot of reading into the early 70s, but we don't really, in exactly the way that Dr. Walker was talking about, we don't have the terminology to capture the shifts that have happened in material conditions and the appropriate responses that movements have had to take in response to that. I look at, well, yeah, so kind of my starting point, my theoretical framework that I really draw on to understand how movements work in all conditions is the work of Frances Fox Piven and her former husband Cloward in their 1976 classic Poor People's Movements, How They Succeed, Why They Fail. And in Piven and Cloward's work, they talk about, if you're not really, if you're not rich enough to kind of buy a lobbyist, or you don't have a cousin in parliament or whatever, basically the way that you kind of, traditionally the way that marginalized people excluded from decisions have found a way to influence how decisions the powerful have been made is by enacting disruption. Disruption is the sort of key term of their whole framework. And again, in this kind of, with this autonomous Marxist understanding, which they were very influenced by, the agency of the working class is often measured by its ability to enact disruption under certain conditions, to force the issue of its own agency. And it actually, contrary to the way that people talk about things a lot, that's the same thing whether you're talking about achieving reforms or whether you're talking to actually overthrowing a system and having a revolution. It's actually, in either case, the same push, the same dynamic at core, which is the agency of the working class asserting itself by disrupting the everyday functioning of things. And the difference between reform and revolution is more what the system is capable of granting. And if it can kind of divide the working class, buy off sectors of it with, more social wage, more, if it can kind of afford to make people happy enough that they back off, some people happy divide against each other, then you have reforms. And if it can't really afford it, you have revolution, or you have, of course, repression, where it tries to sort of shut people up and just stop their disruption through sheer force. Piven, a lot of scholarship that I looked at, Johnson is this one scholar who noted that Seferiadis and Johnson are these two scholars that I like a lot. And they talk about how, looking back over the neoliberal era, we've had like a really acute deficit of disruption. We call it a disruptive deficit. And if you look at, I would say, up until Arab Spring, as Dr. Watch mentioned, was really a key moment in the sort of reappearance of this. But from the onset of neoliberalism until Arab Spring, we had this long period of quietude. And if you look at any of the measures of quality of life, for example, for Black Americans, starkly so, the conditions that caused the riots and the disruption, the uprisings in 1968 into the early 70s have never gotten better. There's no sense that people were sort of had their problems answered. It's that the means of enacting disruption have themselves been kind of undercut. Like in this race between the agency of the working class and capital, capital sort of had a few good decades there outpacing us at what we can get away with. This one historian that I like a lot, Michael Katz, talks about these 5 different vectors of what he calls the institutionalization of dissent, which is another way of sort of seeing how neoliberalism took away our tools of disruption very effectively. He talks about indirect rule, where it's, borrowing a term from British rule in India, where they realized if you have local leaders who look like the local population, who are drawn from the local population, people revolt less, even if they're still following the same policies that still benefit the metropole at the cost of the colonized. So, we see, we have in Seattle right now, which I hope I get a chance to talk about because we're having an interesting situation, but our chief of police is a Black woman, and our mayor is lesbian. And that makes some people kind of, feel like maybe more seen, more represented in the channels of power. But the thing is, they're still doing the same thing. They're still doing this, carrying out the same policies, but it's worked very effectively for the past half century or so to undercut people's sort of understanding some of their symbols that they resist with. Consumerism, obviously, I mentioned before how neoliberalism kind of grabbed onto this sort of individual desires thing when youth were rising up against the model of repression in the 60s and 70s. And neoliberalism has kind of answered that by, overseas enslavement and sweatshops, also by extending easy terms of credit. People were able to buy more cheap stuff and kind of feel their desires manifest in capitalist terms to an extent that discouraged, some of the previous forms of resistance, luckily. And then, in 2008, particularly, that's kind of fallen through as the economy's imploded. And especially the easy credit thing, suddenly when creditors realized they weren't going to get their credit back, it hasn't been working very well for them. The role of nonprofits has really exploded in the neoliberal era as well. A lot of the symbols and even some of the people that were really effective revolutionary tools in the previous wave of global uprisings and 68 through early 70s have kind of found their way into establishments. Piven and Cloward talk about the difference between social movements and social movement organizations. And we forgot to sort of as the social movements have been demobilized, social movement organizations, which have a role in this, but they've come to kind of dominate. And a lot of them, by becoming susceptible to the funding cycle, they have to sort of think if they're subsisting on Ford Foundation wages or whatever, they have to kind of be thinking about not getting too disruptive, or they might disrupt their own income. So the Insight Collective's book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, is a classic work on this, about the ways that the growth of nonprofits has kind of stolen the language of revolution and disruption that people trust and pulled it into, sort of mailing in donations to your representatives and lobbying and doing things very much in the safe channels of power rather than direct disruption. Dr. Walker spoke eloquently, and I think a lot of people speak better than I do about the shift towards policing itself as an issue. I was fascinated to see in the Paris uprisings, now it's about 15 years ago, in the banlieue, in the suburbs of Paris, was one of the first times I think we saw sort of this aberration, this current form of revolt, kind of prefigurative of where we are now. And one of the things that was interesting in that was these sociologists went and interviewed people in those communities and asked them, what are the causes of your uprising? What is it that, what are the problems that young people are reacting to? And when older folks answered it nearly universally, they said, oh, economic inequality and French racist attitudes, and the transit to downtown is terrible, so we have bad job opportunities. When the young people were asked, about 100% of them, or like 90% of them, said police. 0% of the older folks said police. They thought the police are like this mediating factor, or whatever, but they think of them as sort of, not the problem themselves, but just a, point of tension. But for young people, they understand that police themselves are the core point of production of racist inequalities under neoliberalism, because they're sort of, we can come back to that in the Q&A. And then of course, also, there's a lot to say about this. This was just my intro, I almost out of time. But the media, the structure of the media going from relatively independent and willing to sort of show critical perspectives to being very much like owned by a small number of corporations and kind of a watchdog, role, or, like a lapdog from a watchdog role, has definitely changed the conditions that social movements have to kind of exist within. So I just want to, maybe I'll just kind of suggest things that we might want to come back to in the Q&A. But Seattle's a great place to be calling you from right now, because we actually have what I hope is going to be suggestive of the next form of this uprising. We already saw it generalized to a couple of cities last night, and that's that people have turned the point of conflict with police into an autonomous zone. What happened was, I don't know how many of you have been following this, but there were really brutal, protracted fights. I came very close to being shot and killed about a week ago at our main site of protest, where we were fighting with a police station to have space. They got increasingly brutal. Really, this one woman was killed and then brought back to life by police shooting a flashbang grenade at her chest. It's been extremely vicious. Police finally sort of had this great idea, and I'm always thinking again of this sort of agency of the working class versus capital, and the way that plays out through tactics. This was like a really beautiful example of that. The police made a really idiotic miscalculation, and they just decided, you know what, we're just going to pull out. We have this supposedly liberal city of Seattle, like it's getting kind of embarrassing how much we're having to bludgeon these protesters. They're not getting, they're not leaving, so why don't we just pull out of the police station, let them burn it down, and everyone will see that that's so unacceptable. We have no choice but to just break their heads. So they pulled out, and what happened was people protected the police station because they realized that this was a trick, and for something like 5 days now have been kind of fostering this gorgeous autonomous zone with all this public art, with gardens, with the kind of social services that a lot of people don't have access to within within daily life. We're producing this as a sort of, it's kind of, I don't want to take it too seriously, like Trump is claiming the army's going to invade it and everything, and it's not like all that. But in some ways, it really is kind of prefigurative of what an abolitionist democracy would look like, because we're having direct participation with people. There's a way that when you have, I heard about this back in Occupy Oakland, and I think this is really true from what I'm hearing from people in the CHAZ, the Central Hill Autonomous Zone here in Seattle, where you have a space without police, race suddenly does really different things. And in some, if I can say this as a white guy, I think in some ways it starts to sort of dissolve. It starts to very much destabilize without the potential of police to be there. It just immediately changes the reality and the materiality of how race functions in the absence of police. And so you have these phenomenal expressions of Black autonomy and freedom, and just fascinating sort of little micro society growing there. And I talk a lot about, just about out of time, but I talk a lot in some of my scholarship about why movements, particularly since Tahrir Square in Egypt, about almost 10 years ago now, have focused more on, instead of kind of foregrounding demands and claims and saying this isn't fair and, you know, descriptions of injustice, we foreground power, because the neoliberal state, I don't think, really pretends towards justice in the way that the welfare state did. The state that was faced by MLK is not the state that we're presented with Trump or even with Obama, right? It's not even pretending to be fair and to be looking out for everybody, quite the opposite. If you tell, so I think there's some ways that in the, you know, in the 60s, to point out the sort of unfairness of current conditions and the state and policies was a powerful tool that was part of that struggle. In 2020, if you tell Trump that racism is unfair, I mean, he knows that. That's the point. That's what it's for. The whole politics of cruelty is based on kind of a celebration of this inequality and of this injustice, because they feel like they can get away with it. So what social movements have to do is confront it in terms of power, in terms of control of space. And we're seeing that, I think, for example, prefigured in these 6 blocks we've taken over in Seattle. Last night, activists in Nashville, Tennessee took over and established an autonomous zone, and also in Asheville, North Carolina. I think they're dealing with maybe less friendly political structures than, I think they have less to work with sort of liberal hypocrisy than Seattle does. So I'm not sure how they're doing. I'm worried for them. I want to check up on that. But I actually never got around to, I'm out of time. I want to wrap up, and I'm looking for our conversation. I never got around to sort of what, like, maybe I feel like is my biggest contribution to understanding these moments. I guess I'll wrap up with this one. Dr. Walker talked about how these disagreements around violence and nonviolence have really surfaced viciously yet again as a way to really, a key kind of division in the movement. We hear a lot about good protesters and bad protesters, and that's a lot of, you know, the ways that these sort of counterinsurgency discourses work to try to end this stuff. I just kind of want to suggest that it's not coincidence that this moment started in riots, and that the space opened up for these topics, and this new agency has appeared from, you know, the image of a burning police station, for example, and the kind of destruction we saw in the streets of Minneapolis. I don't think that a lot of people sort of shake their heads and say, I get the message, but it's just unfortunate that they had to, you know, be so violent about it. I think that's definitional. That's what opens a space. And I guess I've got a lot to say about that, but what I'm going to, and I have a lot to say about sort of why nonviolence has worked in certain conditions, but not so much in these. But what I'll just end with is this, I think, this take on what's so important about riots and why they're so effective at opening this space. I think riots are a means of forcing comparisons and forcing other people to kind of admit what it is they value. There's this way that every time we see, you know, nearly basically every riot in the United States that since World War II, and with this exception of race riots, which maybe shouldn't be called riots in some ways, in the 20th century and 21st in the US, has actually erupted from police brutality against youth of color, usually murder. And I think it's not a coincidence. I think it's an extremely powerful tool for saying, you know, why is the death of George Floyd routine? Why is that just something that happens? But this burning police station is shocking. Why is, I look a lot at the Baltimore riots from 2015, where Freddie Gray was had his neck snapped in the back of a police van and died some days later. And there was nothing said about it. There were these sort of peaceful protests for a week or two, and nobody really paid attention. And then when riots broke out and all these windows were smashed and all these buildings were burnt, suddenly it was this national panic, and people were actually spray painting on the walls. It's like you care more about broken windows than broken spines. And for me, I think that's what riots say. And in this central scandal of America that's been unspeakable forever and is always murmuring on the surface, but can never, is all of these apparatuses of violence are used to keep from being discussed. I think the power of riot is that it can break through those and force acknowledgement, or at least uncomfortable sort of instability about why we're so shocked and upset about burning things or damaged businesses or something, and somehow have learned to accept genocide of Black people. So thank you, everybody. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Great, Sean. Thank you very much. Thank both of you guys. I'm going to ask a complex question. It's got a bunch of parts, and in the hopes that it will trigger some interest in you guys, and we can hopefully start that way. I'm looking also at the time. I'm thinking now that we'll go another maybe 30 minutes if things are looking fun. Maybe we can go longer than that. We'll just kind of sense out the feel for everybody. So let me start with this. And the question that I want to raise is, given that there seems to be a very important relationship between our current type of capitalism, commodification, what I refer to as now the master signifier in the semiological sense, and that this master signifier subjugates other human values. It seems pretty apparent. Then how do we see beyond the given? Isn't it so that the transcendental function, the function of being able to see beyond the given, isn't it in some ways poisoned and closed by capitalism? And is imagination enough? Or could it be argued that imagination is already prefigured and poisoned in the self, given this master signifier of commodification and the ugliness of our current capitalist system? So subsidiary questions are, is there a praxis for solidarity? And what is it? I know, Dr. Walker, you mentioned that in the description of your talk. What is a rudimentary way to talk about solidarity? What is a way to talk about responsibility? And in these questions, what is the role of the intellectual? What is the role of each human adult? And finally, a couple of other categories. What's the moral component? What is the moral component? And then I would also, if you guys are interested, would really enjoy you speaking about the dialectic between violent and nonviolent resistance, if you would at some point. Who would like to start? Which one of you guys would like to start? Well, they're being very polite.
Corey, I think really the possibility of focusing on possibility is really Corey's, I think. I'd love to hear.
Okay, Dr. Walker, let's start with you.
Now, the idea, I mean, you posit three questions. They're interrelated in a critical way. Simply in terms of how we're posing them in this sort of either or dialectic. So what Amy Césaire also does in Discourse on Colonialism is move us beyond that framework, beyond either or. So we posit a series of seemingly rational dichotomies, but what they do is demonstrate the limit of a particular epistemic regime. But I want to go to the first one on your first question around capitalism and sort of capitalist capture of all values, all human values. What Angela Davis does, and going back and retrieving Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and I would advise everyone to spend time not with the conversations on Black Reconstruction, but actually to go and read Du Bois's 1935 Black Reconstruction, simply because it's a powerful text that animates so many other modes of thinking. But what Davis's retrieval of Du Bois is really a retrieval of how we have to begin to think in tandem around questions of race and around questions of class. This is the same thing with Walter Rodney. Rodney does this in How Europe Underdevelops Africa. Rodney also does this in his lecture at Columbia on race and class and Guyanese politics. Because what Sean pointed to, the issue in Seattle, when you have a Black female police chief. In Minneapolis, you have a Black male police chief. But if you think the power in the police chief in Minneapolis is not with the police department, it's with the police union. So if we're thinking around the politics of racial representation, we have confusion if we're purely talking about race. But you have to see how it is articulated in and around capitalist political economy, so that you know that this police union, along with its white supremacist union head, has a deep investment in the ways in which these policing practices are deployed against low-income Black and brown communities in and around Minneapolis. But to think one logic is to move the other. But capitalism doesn't operate with this absolute capture. It doesn't have that power. Otherwise, we could never talk about, we wouldn't be talking about the American Spring right now. We wouldn't be talking about the uprisings in Ferguson. We wouldn't be talking about the uprisings in Baltimore. We wouldn't be talking about the uprisings coming out as a result of Trayvon Martin. We wouldn't be talking about the wake of the Black freedom struggle. Hell, we wouldn't be talking about the wake of Nat Turner. We wouldn't be talking about the wake of Gabriel's rebellion. We wouldn't be talking about the wake of Haiti. So the idea of capitalist capture is mitigated by the deep variety of human experience itself. So when I think about the ways in which just since 2000, I mean, in 2002, we were in Argentina, and you had the piqueteros who blocked the interstates with fire, with their barricades. And 2005, when we were in Paris, when we had the Paris uprisings and the universities were closed, what we did was we developed ways in which we reopened the university to create the spaces for critical thinking. When we look at the Arab Spring in 2011, and when we go back to Europe, we see Tunisian students reminding us that this isn't just about the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square, but this is really about a revolution in dignity. And Ronald Judy has written eloquently about that. So even when we think about what's going on in Ferguson, or what happened in Ferguson, or the emergence of Black Lives Matter, is really the elaboration of a unleashing of a critical imagination that can never be absolutely captured by capital. It is the same imagination that Kant attempts to arrest in his critical project. Remember, it is the imagination that Kant tries to arrest and critique of pure reason, because the imagination is the space of new possibilities. It's a rationality that exceeds the calculus. So I'm not concerned with capitalist capture of the imagination and values. What we have to do is we have to remember, like Guy Debord reminds us, that the revolution revolutionizes the counter-revolution. It is the channeling of these energies and these political movements and the conceptual movements into the logic of the same. That's what you see the resistance right now. This is why you have going to the forefront of the discourse around defunding the police. And now you see so much action around it to try to avoid the capture of that term into reforms. Is there a praxis of solidarity, of responsibility? That's the deep idea of what solidarity is. It is about a deep responsibility. And what I would argue is that there is an emerging pandemic solidarity. That pandemic solidarity is the risking of one's life to make possible new forms of life. How else do we explain the ways in which individuals have taken to the streets across all 50 states in the US and over 1,000 cities and towns across the nation and across the world in the midst of a global pandemic? This is a moment of pandemic solidarity. This is where everyone is risking their own life for possible forms of new life. And this is the emergence of a planetary solidarity that moves beyond the calculus of what we think of as politics proper. The question I gotta ask is there any wonder why calls for planetary possibility, ideas of abolition democracy, ideas of defunding the police, ideas of abolition prison, cannot be heard within the dominant calculus of politics? That is because we're seeing folks arguing and wrestling for a new world and the new human. And in this new world, we're noticing, just like we picked up with Césaire, that it is not only the human that's at stake, it is also the nation state as sovereign form that is at stake. And that form begins to be challenged, and all of a sudden, new political forms may emerge. Now, remember, this is not to say that the autonomous zones that we see in Seattle, that echo the autonomous zones that were set up in Chicago, that echo the autonomous zones that were set up in the Occupy movement, that echo the ways in these longer trajectories. It's not a saying that this is the end or folks have accomplished it. It is saying that what we're seeing is the emergence of these new forms. Let's not colonize them with old thinking and then try to channel them to arrest them to a logic of the same. And to your last point around the moral ethical component, to risk one's life is to make a moral and ethical statement. To risk one's life in pandemic solidarity, to go to the forefront in these movements, to declare that Black Lives Matter is a deeply, profoundly moral statement with a long genealogy. It questions the very identity of the human that we have in our moral imaginary. Imagine this particular logic. Black Lives Matter emerges as a declarative statement in the 21st century. But it is not unconnected with the 18th century statement, am I not a man and brother? It is not unconnected with the 19th century statement, aren't I a woman? As well as the 20th century statement, I am a man. This is the constant reemergence of a critical, moral, ethical genealogy that challenges the very foundational logics of the Western world. And this is what C.L.R. James writes about in his 1969 lecture on Black Studies in the Contemporary Student. C.L.R. James says, if you don't understand that the world historical event of transatlantic slavery is a fundamental change in the world of 10,000 years, then you can't understand what Black studies means as an intellectual enterprise, or the idea of transatlantic slavery in the modern world, how it then is a fundamental reorganization of all human life. So now we begin to rethink the very basis of our questions and the basis of our engagement. So Idea of capital, cognitive capture, impossible. What you see is unleashing of new modalities of cognitive possibility. Is there a new praxis of solidarity? We see it, pandemic solidarity, the risking of one's life for the possibility of new forms of life. Moral ethical component, it is saturated in and through this particular moment. And it connects to a longer moral ethical genealogy, not only of Black Lives Matter, but am I not a man or brother? Aren't I a woman? I am a man. All of these assertions of emergent forms of humanity. The cognitive capture happens when you have the counter-revolution that is always already going on. And I'll end there.
Let me just quickly add, Corey, that what I'm hearing you say is that these opportunities for sacrifice by saying and by doing actually change our being. They actually change our ontological structure, and they actually change our toolkit, our logic, by making this stand, by engaging in parousia on the street. That it's a participatory emancipation. And it's a participatory liberation. And by engaging in that behavior, it actually changes the toolkit for thinking. That's what I'm hearing you say.
This is exactly what the debate between, and I'll pull on Sean's word, when Sean talks about the debate around nonviolence and violence. The debate in the 60s is about subject formation. You see, what King, the debate between King and Stokely Carmichael between nonviolence is, Stokely always says this, and Stokely stated this eloquently, that nonviolence he saw as a strategy. For King, King saw it as a way of life. Right. What King saw was a whole new subjectivity, a whole new reorientation to life itself. What we tend to do is then funnel that back to a particular strategy overdetermined by the existential terrain. What King was trying to articulate was a whole new way of life and a whole new disposition to creation. That is planetary possibility. And that's where individuals begin to understand that the modality that then moves around that moves around the ways in which folks are going out in ever increasing numbers. This is day 15 of the American Spring, continuing to open up new possibilities. That is not it. If we try to arrest it with the same categories, we will think it's, the same thing. Oh, this is just a protest. This can be something else. Now, we have to temper that. We can't overdetermine that. And this is where I have to go back to the great Ella Baker on this. Ella Baker, who organized the 1960 conference, the student conference at Shaw University, after the sit-in started on February 1st, what would be renamed the February 1st movement. What Ella Baker said was, yeah, this is about something, bigger than a hamburger and a giant-sized Coke. She also noted a new consciousness emerging between both the Black and the white students there. So this idea that we think of in this moment, that this is a multiracial movement, this hasn't been seen. No, there's a longer genealogy. There's a new consciousness that was emerging. There was also a new organizational form and a new leadership form. She's talked about moving away from leader-centered organizations to group-centered leadership. So what you're seeing is the ways in which you see sort of a rhizomatic politics operating. But then she said, and she closed with this, what this all will mean, we'll have to deal with the ways in which the students continue the movement, the ways in which they're trained, and the ways in which they then activate this new politics. We see what we're doing here, and just, it has taken me a minute just to begin to try to develop a framework around what I'm seeing and experiencing. is that same moment, a similar moment in our conjuncture, but I don't want to overdetermine it just yet. I want to keep it open. And that's what the openness that Vincent Harding constantly practices really is instructive for us in this moment. So Kevin, you're right, yeah.
I guess Sunning, so I'm not really sure. I'll just have sort of a couple little footnotes to what Dr. Walker said. I think you just really tore it up. I think I'm sort of noting, I don't know, I'm thinking in terms of like the GCAS format in the course. Like one of the things, a couple of the, maybe this is a really, like I said, sort of superficial aspect of this, but when we're thinking about the role of the intellectual and just sort of us here in a GCAS sort of class, I think if you notice there's a lineage that that Dr. Walker and I are both pulling on that's often sort of forgotten. And there's two things in common with, I'm hearing, there's two things in common with people, like the names that we've been evoking. And it's a sort of forgotten lineage that I think is just a really useful history to remember right now. And just on the intellectual end, which is, I don't think, the core of the struggle or anything, but as long as we're here in this class, but when we're talking about Black Reconstruction and Du Bois's work, I think also like Raymond Williams, beautiful work, I think, as bearing out this, there's a lot in particularly the Marxist tradition. I think there's a split in the Marxist tradition between the sort of fatalism of large scale economic kind of thinking. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the time, the discussions and the responses and the theory in practice that we see around developments, especially in the United States, has this kind of class reductionist angle that forgets Du Bois, that forgets Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, C.L.R. James, and it goes for this kind of de-agentialized form, this kind of fatalistic form. And so I think there's a real power in us remembering this intellectual history that, for one, always centers the agency of not just the agency, exactly what Corey was talking about, the sort of excess of life that always outdistances power ultimately, right? It's this faith in the self-activity of the working class and the excess of humanity and life to outdistance any of the sort of repressive social technologies that, at any given time seem so effective, but you look and they just fail routinely. And so holding on to that intellectual tradition. And there's another book by somebody I haven't heard of that recently until I read his work, but also never talking about, at least in the American context, and it shifts how this relationship shifts globally, but never talking race without class and never talking class without race, talking each through each other. And I was really persuaded by Heaney Lopez. I just started reading him recently. He has this book called Merge Left. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that theory has been so inadequate to dealing with the current like political theory and practice. I think there's a lot of smart people out there, but like the kind of stuff that I hear people, arguing about in political groups or whatever, you have this kind of often DSA sort of class reductionist, economistic thinking. Also the Democrat Party unwillingness to really tackle race directly and face the centrality of racism to American society. That almost defines the Democrat Party. And then on the other hand, you have this kind of identity reductionist sort of talking identity in a void outside of the material conditions, outside of talking about what it's for. And I think another commonality about, certainly you go back to Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and even somebody like more recently Lopez's work, is it's sort of like you can't talk, if you hear like any theory of any of class or race in isolation, it's be suspicious about what's going on, because it's not actually explaining how this country's regimes of accumulation have always worked. I also just wanted to, again, I'm just like throwing up some footnotes to what Dr. Walker said. I think you just covered it beautifully. I think with the pandemic solidarity, I couldn't agree more. It's like we're all thinking in life and death terms, and we're thinking of the morality and life and death choices we have about our daily lives in a way that is pretty unusual. It's a big shift. And I also think we're thinking in terms of a public subject, right? I was kind of wondering about this. in the right when we all had to kind of accept what was going on, and then you see particularly in the anti-lockdown protests, like, you know, you're like, what are these right wingers protesting? Like, why are they taking guns to the, you know, to the Capitol buildings against a virus? Like, what are they going to do with that? But I think what they're doing is they're actually consistent right wingers in that they don't want to see the appearance of a public self. But unavoidably, I think even, you know, like the large majority of the country basically thought that those people were jerks. And I think the majority of the country, including a lot of conservatives, realize the only way we're going to survive is to see ourselves in others, and to be part of a public subject, and that our, you know, atomized monad neoliberal selves is literally going to kill us. If that's our sense of self, we're dead. And so I think that precedent, it's the fact that, as Dr. Walker talked about, is life and death is immensely important, and the scale of it as a shared self, as realizing very literally your life and death are in the hands of a lot of people you'll never meet, and the life and death of a lot of people you'll never meet is in your hands with how you conduct yourself every day. That's like I think that just shattered a lot of the social technologies that have held us in place and created this possibility of solidarity. And I think, again, it's just, but drawing on that theory where we're always remembering the contingency of capital's dominance, and looking back at history, not as this ironclad march of this one developmental Hegelian, I shouldn't say Hegelian here, you know, unfolding of one plot. Whereas, you know, if you look closer at sort of sublimated subaltern histories, there's always these conditions of possibilities. There's always the domination is always unstable, and there's always room for things to pop off, and indeed they always do. I think the one thing that I'm going to throw in as maybe something that I've covered about, that I focused on in my scholarship, is what Kevin was asking us about, this dichotomy between violence and nonviolence and how that works out in our current moment. I talked about some of it in the centrality of riots, and I think partially what we're talking about with this outdistancing of the imagination through the present, through the taint of the present, right? I mean, it sort of goes back to the good old Chomsky-Foucault debates on Dutch TV, right? Where, you know, I think Chomsky is just sort of like, if we just get the right institutions, we'll be fine. And Foucault's like, you're crazy. Any institution we do is going to reinscribe the totality of like our current system. There's sort of cartoon opposites for this issue, right? But I think obviously we can get beyond the present, because you look and it happens all the time. And I think, for one thing, getting beyond the conditions of the present is a violent, in a kind of Lacanian sense, but also in just a very newspaper headline sense. Getting our imagination out of the present is a violent process necessarily. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that there tends to be physical embodied violence when you see people suddenly able to do that. I think it has to accompany it. I think what's important to look at is the kind of violence that accompanies that can really change with different conditions. And for example, you know, in the 60s, everybody was talking about Fanonian violence, which is against the body of the colonizer, often, you know, in terms of mutilation and death, so that the sort of sacredness of the colonizer's body is undone. And the colonized suddenly becomes a full human by undoing the domination through the body of the colonizer, right? That's very powerful. It seems obviously to have something to it, but that's one form and one kind of situation with one kind of implications. And I think, for one thing, I've noticed a lot of the people who kind of talk in terms only from that era think that if we're talking about violence, that's the kind we're talking about, because so many people in the 60s and 70s were looking at what was happening in Vietnam with the Viet Cong. We're looking at what's happening with that current moment, the post-World War II moment of overthrowing European colonialisms in all these different, you know, through the global South. And so they think guns as the first thing. And one thing that's interesting is, certainly in 2011, certainly in 2014 to 2016, and mostly in our current moment, asterisk, guns are not what people mean by violence, right? When we see people burning down the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, it's very different sort of, I think it's a violent act. I think it's sort of silly to say something of that scale and that destructive is nonviolent. I think it's violent, but it's not against bodies. And I think that is a really important aspect to the way that it signifies. And I think what it does is it sort of points up how the old social order is itself so routinely injurious, mutilating, and murderous to bodies and lives, whereas the kind of violence that people can enact in those moments of resistance can kind of suggest a different moral order, that like maybe the thing can burn, but we can actually kind of respect each other in our bodies and our lives and our dignity. I think one more thing I'm going to throw in that's I found very helpful when looking at King's moment, and as Dr. Walker was talking about the way that he was kind of imagining a whole new subject, a whole new American subject in his political approach, and not just sort of tactically nonviolent, but he was trying to use it to kind of come up with a new American. One of the interesting things actually Dr. King himself says is that I really zeroed in on this one speech where he talks about the importance of not conflating nonviolence with weakness, and the kind of avoiding conflict and just sort of not standing in the face of injustice cannot be conflated with actual active struggle nonviolence. And I think I think it's a really important thing to sit with. But when I was trying to figure out what is the line between those, how do you actually tell? One thing that struck me is he actually sort of says, he has this sort of list of characteristics of the difference between real nonviolence and mere weakness. And one of the things he says in that seems to be pretty salient is he says, one cannot call oneself nonviolent merely because you lack the means of enacting violence. And I parsed that. I'm an English teacher, I grade student papers and stuff. So I was like parsing that and kind of taking out the double negatives and everything. I was like, wait a minute. I think what he just said is you actually need the capacity to enact violence in order to be nonviolent. And I think if you look at the moments of really powerful transformative nonviolence, such as the moments of King's campaigns that certainly worked, and Gandhi's, and the classic examples, it's that they're always accompanied by violence. And so when they say they're accompanied by violence, sometimes within their movement, sometimes sort of adjacently, but when they say, it's basically, I think, effective, powerful revolutionary nonviolence is a way of saying, look, we could do this. We have this power to do this right now. Can we do something better? Can we do something else? How about we don't do this? How about we, instead of going there, let's just agree not to and do something else. So there's a real power in that. I don't mean to be dismissive of it. A lot of critics of nonviolence have been very dismissive of those moments. I feel awestruck by those. And I think when movements are strongest is when you see that kind of enactment. It's a beautiful thing when it can happen, but you have to be able to enact violence in order to say, but I'm not going to, right? And I think when we're looking, I think part of the institutionalization of dissent and part
Hey, Kevin, Sean went on mute.
Sean, you were on mute, Sean.
How long was I on mute?
Just about 20 seconds. And
okay, good. I thought you were going to say 20 minutes and I was going to cry.
No, you're doing just great.
Okay, great. Could somebody let me know what was the last thing I said?
No, just take a breath and come back to it. We'll give you the time.
I guess I can rewind 20 seconds in my head. All I'm just wondering is where I left off, where you heard me. Basically, in the historical moments of powerful nonviolence, in that context, you always find actual violence, right? And so for powerful revolutionary nonviolence to be effective, it has to be able to disown violence that's actually palpably there. And I think the weakness that haunted movements for decades that accumulated in this disruptive deficit was because we got confused about that. And we started avoiding conflictuality. We started, thinking that you could kind of just talk things out and forgetting that there's inherent antagonisms at the basis of our organization of society. And we forgot the need for direct conflict and essentially violence But rather than, and what that did was that took a big hit on our agency. Rather than falling for that again, what I think we would be well considered to do is consider the forms of violence and, you know, what kind of worlds, what kind of social selves do we want to, what kind of subjects do we want to be forming by the kinds of violence that we enact? And I think we can ask that ourselves as a profoundly moral question, but I'm seeing social actors in the movements right now asking themselves the same thing. And I think taking a lot of trouble to prefigure the future that they want, to model the future that they want, to model that abolitionist democracy in, you know, forcing police out and saying, we're not just going to cow down to you, we're going to fight you, we're going to make sure you don't come near us, and also really caring for each other.
Thank you very much. I think, gentlemen, we're fairly close to the end of our time today. I know that there are many, many questions, and there's a lot more room for more discussion. The hope is that, you know, each of us can walk away from this event with some new questions. I have new questions myself. So let's close our session. If either of you guys wants to make a final comment, this is a good time to do it, and then we'll close and I'll say a couple things and we'll move forward with the day.
Thanks for the opportunity to engage, and I really appreciated everyone showing up, and let's continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really fantastic conversation.
Thank you both very much. It's Saturday, right? On a Saturday, that's just great. I'm going to give yield the floor back to Anthony and Andrew. Thank you for allowing me to be here, to be a part of this event. And we'll see you soon. I think we're going to have another event tomorrow, but this ends our time for today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.